All right. Now I think we are live fully. Hi, and welcome everyone in the next webinar in our Plantae webinar series. My name is Jason Padilla, and I am your technical host for today's webinar. This webinar series is brought to you today by Plantae, the open online community for plant scientists powered by the American Society of Plant Biology. Next slide. I would like to give a special thank you to all our ASPB members who are attending our today's webinar. Your ASPB membership dues help make this webinar possible. For any of you who have not yet joined ASPB, you can join today using the discount code %10 to receive a 10% discount on your registration. ASPB members get early access to this webinar, and you can learn more about ASPB and all the other opportunities we provide at aspb.org. Next slide. In addition, I want to highlight that a lot of our webinars are recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. So if you're looking for additional exciting talks and helpful resources, be sure to check out our Plantae YouTube channel to watch previously recorded webinars. Next slide. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items to make sure that you get the most out of your experience for attending today's webinar. If you are experiencing technical issues, please let us know about those by using the chat box or emailing me directly at jpadilla@aspb.org. If you have questions for our guest speakers, please add them throughout the webinar and in the Zoom Q&A section. Our moderators will be sharing them with our presenters after all our talks. If you have trouble connecting or need to leave the webinar early, again, as I mentioned, this webinar is recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. So be sure to follow our YouTube channel to receive notifications when this webinar is uploaded and any new content is posted. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to our moderators who are some of our Plantae Fellows who will facilitate today's session. And so take it away.
Right, thank you, Jason, and thank you to everyone for attending our webinar. We hope that it'll be helpful for those of you who are currently applying for jobs or planning to be in the future, or maybe just people who are interested in learning a bit more about the process. We know it's an important topic, and we can probably all agree that applying for jobs can be quite daunting, and it can be difficult to get started. It can also be difficult to know how to make yourself stand out and how to make the best first impression, because that is, after all, what your CV and your cover letter are when you're applying for a job. It's your first impression. So we're hoping that this webinar will give you some insight into this topic from a few different perspectives from both industry and academia, and will hopefully demystify the process for you a bit and give you a bit more confidence as you're starting to apply for jobs. But just to kick things off, we're your moderators and we'd like to introduce ourselves. So I'll go first. My name is Grace Pender. I'm a second year PhD student in University College Dublin in Ireland, studying plant genetics with the UCD Flower Power Lab.
And I'm Rose, so I'm a third year PhD student. I'm at the John Innes Centre in Norwich in the UK, and I'm studying endosperm starch in wheat and its wild relatives.
Hi everyone, my name is Chicky Zan. I'm assistant professor at East Stroudsburg University, a predominantly undergraduate institute, and my research focuses on the phosphate or the other nutrition dynamics during the avascular mycorrhizal symbiosis. Is one of the kind of plant and the fungal interactions.
Great. So now that you've met your moderators, I'd like to just very briefly for the minute introduce you to our three invited guest speakers who you'll be hearing more from shortly. So first we'll be hearing from Jiawen Chen, who completed her PhD in the John Innes Centre and will soon be starting a new postdoc in a new postdoctoral position. Next, we'll be hearing from Rainer Melzer, lecturer at University College Dublin in Ireland. And finally, we'll be hearing from Hector Wheatley, who works in talent acquisition in Illumina. So while the structure of today's webinar is that we'll have short interviews with our three speakers, but we'd also very much like to hear from you guys and answer questions that you have about CVs and cover letters. So throughout the webinar, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box throughout the session. They can be general questions, but if you have a question for a specific speaker, just let us know their name so we can know who to address it to. And we'll be having our Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So one last thing I'd like to mention before we kick off with our interviews is I think we're aware that there's probably a diversity of career stages in our viewers today. So maybe for some of you, you've never written a CV before or applied for a job where you needed a cover letter. And while we're kind of focusing today on things that can make your application stand out, we know that for some of you, maybe this will be the first time you're going through this process and you don't know even where to begin, which is understandable. So what we've included here are just a list of a few resources of some of the kind of more fundamentals of CV construction and cover letter writing. So we have some links to some articles here, and to the right, you'll notice a QR code that'll bring you to a list of resources for CV writing and cover letter writing. So let's begin. Just in case you're arriving a bit late, this is the structure of our webinar. So we will be having a discussion with our three speakers and then a Q&A session before we conclude. So with all that being said, I think we're good to get started with our first interview. So I'll hand over to Rose and Jawen.
Great, thank you, Grace, for the introduction and for setting the scene of the webinar. So we're going to spend the next 10 minutes or so chatting to Jawen. So Jawen, would you like to just sort of like introduce yourself to everyone and tell everyone a bit about yourself and your background and where you are in your career?
Yeah, thanks, Rose. So I'm Jawen, and I finished my PhD December 2022 at the John Innes Centre in Norwich in the UK, working on starch granule initiation. And then I did a 6-month short postdoc in the same lab, finishing off some stuff for my PhD as well. And that just ended recently. And in September, I'm going to start a new postdoc in Leuven in Belgium, working on ethylene biosynthesis in Mercantia. So it's a bit different from what I've done in my PhD. So if you want to hear anything about kind of switching different topics and applying for things like that, just let me know.
So you must have written quite a few CVs in your time, like when you were like applying for your PhD and when you're applying for postdoc. So like when you first started to write CVs, like when was it? Was it easy? Was it difficult? How did you find the process?
Yeah, so in terms of during my PhD, like this kind of CV, I kind of started in the second year of my PhD, which was in 2020, because I think I just kind of discussed with my supervisor about CVs in general, and he said it's like a good time to maybe just start putting one together so you have one in the background and then you can easily add stuff to it whenever something new comes up in case you forget anything, because you're building up different kinds of experiences during the PhD. And I thought that was really useful. And so my supervisor gave me a template of the CV that he used during his PhD, and that was really helpful because I could kind of just copy over the format of that, and that's kind of how I started with mine. And it was quite a long CV, which is not something that I was used to previously. So that was mainly what was different compared to writing CVs when I was applying for the PhD, for instance.
So what about developing your CV during your PhD? Was it something you kind of thought consciously about and was like, I need to do this to put it on my CV, or did it happen naturally? How did you find that process?
Yeah, so I always quite enjoyed doing all kinds of activities during my PhD and also trying to just learn new things and gain experience. So for example, I was also a Plantae Fellow for a year. And right now I'm doing the assistant features editor, a scheme that ACEPB also runs, just mainly because I quite enjoy writing and reading and things like that. And I want to develop these skills, and I'm thinking about a career in scientific journals in the future as well. So I did a lot of these kinds of activities because I wanted to gain experience in general, but that kind of also helps with building up the CV. So I was thinking about these things consciously, but for many different reasons, because I wanted to gain experience, because I was interested, and also things like science communication activities that our institute organized. Whenever there was an opportunity, I wanted to sign up to those. So kind of thinking about it, but also not specifically to build the CV, say.
No, that sounds like a really good way to approach it. It's sort of like following what you're interested in and what you enjoy, but also then building up your CV at the same time. So then it's not a stressful process. And that's probably a really good bit of advice for everyone watching today. So we've kind of talked a bit about CVs. So we're going to switch gear and talk a bit about cover letters. So have you ever written a cover letter? How did you find the process? And how did you go about it, basically?
Mm-hmm. So I've mainly applied to postdocs at the end of my PhD and at the end of this 6-month short postdoc that I did. So all of those required a cover letter. So I applied to a few different positions, and I wrote a specific cover letter for each of those. And because postdocs are very specific, I did write quite a kind of a new one for each, but there were sections that I could take over and recycle from different parts, for example, about my experiences, what I did in my PhD and that kind of stuff, but then just highlighting different aspects of that. And so how I usually went about it was looking at what they said in the job advert and making bullet points of what I wanted to say regarding that specific job. So hitting the points that they required, and then thinking about what I wanted to say that was relevant to that job. And for me, in general, in writing, I find that helps to first make bullet points to just make sure I've got down what I want to write about. And then as a second step, try to weave that together into a cover letter that's about a page long. And so usually it would be something about that job specifically first, and something about my background, and then something about why I fit particularly well for that job. So I think looking at the job advert, very detailed for each of those jobs, that helped.
That's a really good bit of advice, and something I might not have done myself, but I really like the idea of the bullet points and then taking that into the cover letter. Did you get any advice or feedback from anyone on your cover letters? Did you know how to go about starting it, and if you were writing a good cover letter?
Yeah, so when I kind of started job applications, I asked my supervisor to help read over my cover letter. But I think I did that for maybe 1 or 2 applications. And then I thought, okay, I kind of get the idea and get the gist of it. And then I kind of just did it by myself. But I know for some people, it's also helpful to have someone not involved in science read over it. So someone that maybe just in general has more experience with jobs and things like that. I didn't personally do that, but I can see how that would be helpful. But for me, it was mainly just my supervisor helping with it, also because I was applying to postdocs specifically.
Yeah, no, it's really good to get that support from someone really close to you, like your supervisor. So you mentioned about you were changing and adapting that cover letter, really personalizing it to the different positions you're applying for. With the CV, was that similar, or did the CV stay more or less the same? How did you work with that?
Yeah, the CV was mostly the same, but because I applied over quite a long time span, for some postdocs I applied kind of at the end of my actual PhD, and for some of them I applied when I was doing the postdoc. So my CV had changed a little bit in that entire time period. So just because of different experiences, it changed a bit, but the overall structure and overall was on it stayed mostly the same. I think the only thing, the major change that I did for one of the applications was in the job advert, it said specifically to include a skills section and talking about your lab skills and your computational skills. So I added that in, which I didn't have specifically previously. But overall, it was mostly the same-ish.
Nice. So we might have some people listening who are like undergrads about to apply for PhDs. So if you remember back to like your CV you were using when you applied to PhDs, how is that different from a CV you're using now or use now to apply for postdoc positions?
Yeah, when I was applying for the PhD, I used kind of the typical the CV that I think most people have when they apply for jobs, which is maximum 2 pages. So it was much shorter than what I've used to apply for postdocs. And I also included some stuff that maybe wasn't directly relevant to the PhD, like societies that I was a part of at uni, or like some part-time jobs and volunteering and that kind of stuff, because I thought that's just kind of general experience, but that kind of stuff I don't include unless it specifically has to do with like science communication and that kind of thing.
No, it's really reassuring for people applying to PhDs that you can put some of that stuff, which you might not think is directly relevant, but really helps build your character and you as a person onto your CV. One other thing I wanted to ask was that at the start, you mentioned that you're starting a postdoc and it's in kind of like a new area. So how did that work with your CV and cover letter? Did you have to explain that your skills might not be directly relevant? How did you go about that?
Yeah, so for the CV, there weren't any big changes because it's quite general stuff like, I did my degrees here and I went to these conferences and stuff. But then for the cover letter, definitely, I think sort of emphasizing why I wanted to do this specific postdoc, even though the subject was a bit different, and highlighting kind of, even though it's a different topic, which parts of my experience were relevant. So for instance, it's still metabolism because I worked on primary metabolism, starch previously, and now it's hormone biosynthesis. So even though it's quite different, just highlighting which parts were relevant, and also maybe because I'm from a bit of a different background, what I could bring to the table on this new project.
That's really nice to hear. So it's good to hear that even if you're in sort of like a different area, you can change a bit, and it's all about adapting that cover letter and showing why you're interested. I think that's been a really interesting discussion. I'm sure a lot of people will have learned a lot from that and really enjoyed hearing your views and perspectives, and well done on getting that new postdoc job. So we'll now move on to the next part of the webinar, and I'll transfer over to Grace, who'll be giving some advice from academia with Raina.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting to hear the perspective of someone who's recently gone through the process. But I think the next couple of parts of the webinar will be focusing not on the person writing the CV and cover letter, but the people who will be reading them, which is hopefully going to give you some insight into the process. So I'm glad to introduce our next speaker, Rainer Meltzer. So if you could maybe briefly introduce yourself and give us a bit of information on your background, please.
Hello, so my name is Rainer. I'm an assistant professor at University College Dublin in Ireland. We work on plant genetics on different crops, but mainly at the moment on hemp. And we're mainly interested in the genetics of reproductive development. So we analyze flowering time, sex determination, plant architecture in hemp.
Great. Now that you have this position in UCD, maybe it'd be helpful to think back a little bit about your own experience when applying for PhD, postdoc, and your current role now, and what insight that has given you into what makes, in your opinion, a good CV or a good cover letter.
Yeah, so I think, I've been writing and reading CVs for a pretty long time now. And I think what makes a good CV, my main suggestion would probably be, keep in mind that you write the CV for the reader and not for yourself. So that when you're writing the CV, you need to stand in the shoes of the person on the other side that may not have all of the specific knowledge that you have, and that may also not want to read 30 pages of a document. But what is important is to be concise, I think, and have your experience and your skill set clearly laid out in one specific document. And this applies, I think, across all career stages, whether you apply for a PhD position, postdoc, or for a position in academia. The person on the other side probably will read for a particular job application anything between 30 and 300 CVs. So the information needs to be organized very clearly.
Yeah, I think as you're correct, like you're right, there's often for one advertised position, there's probably hundreds of applicants, and you're one person who's going to be reading all of them. And I suppose it can be quite time consuming. So you have to go through these and be able to make some decisions about who it is based on the CV that and the cover letter, who you'll be inviting to interview. So from your perspective, what would be some things that would really make a candidate stand out for the right reasons and make you want to definitely invite them for interview? And what would be a few things that you would caution people to avoid when writing these things?
So I would say one of the most important things is clarity. So think about how you will design and organize your CV. Have different sections related to your experience, related to what you've been doing in your research or what you are interested in, what kind of activities that are maybe not directly relevant for your research, but that are related, for example, to outreach activities or something like that. Or if you have been reviewing for journals, what kind of experience do you have there? And list all this in different sections. I would prefer personally a bullet point format so that the information can be easily digested by the person on the other side. So ideally, the person reading the CV within a few minutes will get a feeling for who the candidate is who is actually applying for the job. What I would avoid is being like providing too much detail. Like I've seen CVs where like entire papers were included that the candidate has been publishing, or where a lot of unnecessary information was provided, or where the information was maybe also not neatly organized, but scattered all over the place, so that it takes a long time to actually find the information. What I also would say is try to tweak your CV, but particularly also your cover letter to the job advert. And so for the CV, that probably is a limited amount of work because the CV is the CV, even though you can maybe highlight particular skills that are relevant for a particular job. But for the cover letter, you should really invest a little bit of work and tweaking the cover letter to the job you're applying for. And that starts already with maybe mentioning the name of the person with whom you want to work, instead of having a generic dear sir or madam as a start. And then maybe include a few specific sentences why you are interested in that particular job.
I think, yeah, I think that's brilliant advice, and it really ties in with the approach that Jiawen took, which I think would be very valuable, because it is hard if you're writing a lot of applications to rewrite something over and over, whereas her advice about having sort of core bits staying similar and then changing things, certain parts to tailor for specific applications, I think is a really good approach that will make sure your cover letter, for example, is personal, but you don't have to write one from scratch every single time.
Yeah, I took, when I applied for positions, I took exactly the same approach as Java, and I had like a core piece of information that I would include, but then I tweaked the cover letter always a little bit. So, I mean, originally your inclination is probably to say, I just want this job, give it to me. But you need to invest a little bit of work to highlight and to also think about, why do you actually want it? What does interest you about that position? And then that makes it probably also a bit easier to write the cover letter.
Yeah, definitely. I think making sure it's personal be a good first impression to let someone know that you actually read through the guidelines that they gave you when you were applying. So one other question that I have for you is, from your perspective, what would you think for you is one of the most important aspects of the CV? So is it, for example, someone's experience, their publications, outreach, their grades, things like that? And would that be different for you if you were interviewing, say, for a master's by research position, a PhD position, or a postdoc? Would the emphasis change as someone progresses through their career?
I think the more senior the position gets, probably the more important publications, for example, become. Whereas if you apply for a research master or PhD, I wouldn't say publications are, I wouldn't expect that a student has published at that stage. I would more look towards the specific skill set or experience they have. At a later stage, if for postdoc, I think it makes it definitely easier if you have published already and if you can support your application with a publication. With respect to the cover letter, I would say the cover letter is also an opportunity if there's anything that you can't immediately mention in the format of the CV. You can highlight that in the cover letter. Let's say you want to switch topics. You've been working on cancer, for example, for your PhD, but now you want to work on plant genetics. Then you can explain in your cover letter your motivation, why you want to change fields, and why you feel still a suitable candidate for that particular position. And I think that is really, from my point of view, entirely possible at many career stages. But it is worth probably then highlighting that anything that is a little bit unusual, highlight that in the cover letter and explain why you are doing that. If you want to switch to a different career, or maybe if you have been in a position for a long time, but now you want to do a PhD. I think all of those things that make you a little bit different from the normal candidate are worth probably explaining, and that can be really sometimes beneficial. You know, maybe the lab is looking for a person who has experience, for example, in genomics, but it doesn't really matter whether it's cancer genomics or plant genomics.
Thank you very much. I think that has been very insightful and really valuable for us to hear your perspective on the other side as a PI, as a supervisor, getting all these applications in and what you're screening for and what you'd be interested in when you're looking at these applications and CVs and cover letters. So just before I hand over to our next speaker, just a reminder that you can use the Q&A function down below to ask any questions. We have a few coming in, but please feel free to keep asking. Thank you again, Rainer, for that, for your insight. And I'll hand you back over to Rose and Hector.
Thank you, Grace.
Thanks, Grace, for a really great chat with Rainer. That was really insightful. I found it really interesting to hear what the do's and don'ts are for an academic CV. So now we're going to shift gears and think about writing a CV and cover letter for a more industry type position. So Hector, you work for Illumina. Would you mind just telling everyone a bit about your background, maybe how you got to where you were and what your job actually involves?
Sure, absolutely. So thank you for having me here. So I'm probably the only non-scientist here, I believe, which is a good point to start with, that not everyone reading your CV is always going to understand everything about what you do. And so the point on being clear, I thought was a really good one. So I went to Sheffield University and studied politics. Not sure what I was trying to do with that. But following on from that, I went into recruitment because I wanted to actually work with technology companies in Cambridge. And the best way to get involved in lots of startups at that time was to do kind of recruitment. And I did that for a few years. And then I felt I wanted to go work for a company that kind of aligned more closely with my values and sort of contribute longer term to something great. And so a job came up at Illumina and I applied for it and got it. So that's how I ended up here. What I do here is I run all of our early careers programs for Europe. And so that's anything to do with internships, graduate programs, apprenticeships, and a bit of work experience as well. And I run lots of kind of events internally, some of them like this as well, on how to get out there internally and externally, job-wise.
Great, thanks. It's also really helpful, like for everyone out there, knowing that not everyone looking at their CV is going to be a scientist. So making sure that we don't sort of like fill it completely with all scientific key terms, like, because that's the way we could potentially lose our audience before we've even started.
Yeah, and I was going to say, we just to add on that, we do often, if it's a really complicated position or it's very scientifically focused, obviously we will use hiring managers who understand that underlying scientific words. But I think it's just a point to raise that the initial screener may not understand that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure everyone here wants to make sure their CV passes that initial screen and all the way through to that interview process. So it's very useful to know. What I was wondering was that we've just heard about like academic CVs and writing a CV for an academic position. Are there any differences when you're writing a CV for a more industry position? Do you see any differences in the CVs you receive?
Yeah, I think I noticed quite a big difference between the two. I noticed people who are coming out of either doing their PhD or postdoc and they're applying into industry, and sometimes they tend to have a lot longer CVs, including lots of detail that may not be relevant to the position they're applying for. It's always nice to have publications, but if we have people who've been around a while and they've got 2 pages of publications, copy and paste on the end of their CV, that's great, but probably worth highlighting. You can summarize that in a lot quicker than using up 2 pages, and actually highlighting the relevant one shows you've actually taken the time to understand what the business does, as well as how the research fits into what the rest of the business does. Because I interview a lot of graduates who sometimes will go on a call with me and not even know what Illumina does and how the business really works. So I think the key difference probably is length and the specificity of the detail that is included. I think we've touched on it a few times, but making sure it's clear that you've actually read the advert, but also if you're coming from industry, looking for those transferable skills and understanding what the company, as well as that role, is going to want to see in terms of skills. So at Illumina, if you're an R&D, you often will have to actually present and you have to do lots of presentations in public and sometimes do quite a lot of fairly public speaking, normally within your team. So skills such as that can also be an advantage. Doesn't mean everyone has to be a great public speaker, but it's just something to be wary of.
So is that like transferable skills section one of the most important sections of a CV for you when you're doing that initial screening?
I think it depends on the person, but yes, I think transferable skills is if you're coming from academia, definitely something to focus on and think very clearly on, and also demonstrate that you can understand a little bit of that commercial side. Doesn't have to be loads and loads, but we also have a lot of people who apply from an R&D position, and they will pivot to more of a commercial role once they actually interview with Illumina, because they realize that there are roles that you can still do lots and lots of science, but you're just slightly different in terms of your outlook. So yeah, transferable skills definitely, but I would say kind of that first initial paragraph, your last thing you've done, the 1 or 2 key projects that kind of hit you in the face, because as touched on before, everyone gets a lot of applications and there's often one person reading 100, 200 CVs, and you need to have some wow factor in that the first thing someone screens, so that they can remember it, it sticks out And I would suggest using kind of evidence-based or a project that's obviously gonna stand out to us.
Yeah, that's some really good advice in there. I found that really helpful. I was scribbling away, writing down notes for myself. I thought that's really helpful. So when a lot of people here might come from a very like specific background, like from a PhD or from a straight out of an undergraduate degree, and might not have any industry experience. So is mainly it using that transferable skills section to show what you've got, or is there anything else you can do to try and show off that potential to work in industry?
Yeah, I think you can look at doing sort of courses on LinkedIn, or there's all sorts of online courses you can do now that to give some form of certificate. It doesn't have to be something that's really, really detailed. It could be a week or two. But I think proving that you're clearly interested in the area and you actually thought about it isn't just the fact that you've heard of Illumina because you did some work in your undergrad on one of our sequences as an example, and you just applied to all the big names, but actually you've thought about what would actually be interesting to us. So I think that would be what I would say. Yeah, I think that's the main one.
No, that's really helpful. I'd never thought of doing like some of these online courses you see advertised on LinkedIn, but if they're sort of like well viewed, maybe that's something to definitely look into a bit more. What I was wondering was that, like, do you have any preferences in terms of like the style of the CV or the length of the CV and stuff like that? Because we've heard from academia that it's a bit more freedom, but are there very strict sort of like expectations which you see?
Yeah, again, I think length, I think I would normally suggest sticking to 2 pages. Anything that goes beyond that, it's probably not going to get read, at least not for a while. Some managers may read it, some of them go through them all with a fine comb, but most of the time you'll find, I'd say length should be about 2 pages. I'd say, again, focus on the very specific transferable skills, and focus on projects that are going to be very relevant, but also provide kind of clear evidence as to how that relates to this role. If you've got, and come back to the last question a little bit, if you've spent a lot of time and you haven't necessarily worked in industry yet or had much work experience, picking up those projects and thinking of ways in which they can fit into the company you're applying for would be the way to look at it. So that, I think that's the thing to focus on, definitely.
No, that's really helpful. And the last thing I wanted to ask is about cover letters in industry. Is it something you often see in industry, and how do you approach a cover letter for industry, if so?
Yeah, I think coming back to the point that I think was someone else raised earlier, is bringing in some of your bullet points from your CV, but just expanding on some of them as and when becomes necessary. So I would say tweak your CV to the role, but also for your cover letter, you've got a lot more leeway to make it much more specific to that particular job. You can give more. Sometimes people give a little bit of a personal reason as well. So for us, if someone has a reason that they want to do some work in cancer genomics, for example, that little bit of a personal story and personal touch as to the why you're applying also helps if it fits in with our mission. So it's not just always the technical skills, it's not just always the soft skills. Actually, sometimes we want to see a bit about you in that cover letter. So a bit about you, and then impact of the projects that you've led or been a part of, and where you think. Also be honest about the gaps you might have in your knowledge, because that's a really good time to address any problems you foresee. So if someone thinks if you think there's a big gap in your knowledge applying to a job, you can deal with that sort of objection in your cover letter. So that's a really good time to address it, and explain kind of how you would overcome that gap in knowledge or that gap in technical experience, or say you're working towards this certificate or whatever, anything like that. I think it's a really good time to address that, so you can get ahead of that before you get to interview.
Amazing. That's been really helpful. I didn't know much about like applications to industry, and I think that's really like demystified the whole process for me and hopefully everyone else watching. So thank you so much. I'd also like to thank our other 2 panelists as well. This section's been really useful. I think we've all learned a lot from it. So remember to post some questions in that Q&A box, because I'm now going to hand over to Shiki, and we're going to go over the questions which you've been sending in, and we're going to put these to our panelists. So Shiki, if you'd like to take over.
Hi, thank you, Rose. Our questions are pouring in, and there's a lot of very good questions. So I would, at the beginning of each question, I would like to ask who this question might be addressing to. But if any of the speakers have opinions want to chime in, they're welcome to do so. So our first question now, probably going to address to all speakers, that are online CVs templates useful, or do they produce CVs which all look the same? Is it obvious if a CV is made using a pre-made template or an online generator? Does it put the screeners off or the employers off?
It wouldn't put me off as long as they use that template effectively and make it very clear. I don't actually, the layout is important, but I don't care that someone else has also used the same layout. I care that what the content is, and that it's clear. So I'd rather have a reused layout that's clear than a make up your own template and then it's not clear.
Yeah, I agree with that. I actually don't know any of the templates available online, so I think if you can use it effectively, it wouldn't bother me. There's also a question about photographs, I think. So I think in most countries, actually, including photographs in the CV is not encouraged, so I would rather stay away from that. I mean, It depends a little bit on the country. I mean, I think in Germany, it's still very common to include a photograph, but in most other countries, actually not.
Great. And our second question is also to address to all speakers that when trying to decide on which position you apply for as a postdoc or other more advanced positions, is it necessary to have met all the requirements listed or skills listed on the job post before applying?
I can maybe say I think I've worried about this quite a bit as one. I don't know if it's a correct answer because I don't know what people thought about my applications. But I also applied if it was very interesting and I didn't meet all of the requirements. I think especially if you meet some of them, and especially if some of them are quite specific to the job, and then one other one you don't really have experience for, that you can definitely still apply for it.
I would always say apply if it's interesting and you think it's not insurmountable. Often we have roles we release at a certain level and then someone applies who's great but doesn't have, is missing a bit of experience, and we might move the role down a little bit until that person has gained that experience internally, and we'll train them up. So people are much broader normally in that, not every company, but in their outlook when they're hiring. They want to find someone great, not necessarily a person who exactly fits these skills that they've written down.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if in doubt, rather apply. And because you never know who else is applying, and you might still be the best person for the job, even if you don't hit all of the required characteristics.
Oh, I just want to add one thing. I think always apply, but maybe don't be too disappointed if you don't get it, because sometimes, especially academic positions, put out very specific requirements because they already have someone in mind.
Yeah,
that's a very good point. Thank you. That's very clear answers. And the next question also addressed to all speakers. Is it okay to include your past experience to your CV, even though it's not quite related to the job that you're applying for? So I think we've already answered some of it. There are some other opinions about it.
I think if it's not relevant, I think just make it small and summarize it very quickly. Don't dwell on it. Is my point.
I think sometimes you can use it to your advantage. Like if you have been, for example, a coach for a soccer team, you can say that this shows your leadership qualities and your ability to work in a team, even though it's not really directly related to science. It still can demonstrate that you have transferable skills that can be used in science.
Great. The next question might be addressed to Jiawen and Rainer. So when you write cover letter, do you write that what do you want to work related to the project which your host professor got, or do you suggest more innovative research ideas and new methods research related to the project?
Probably both, I think, because you want to address, like, if it's an advert for a specific project, you want to address like the goals of that project, but then you want to make yourself unique. So I think people probably always like hearing about what you can bring to the table as well. So probably both of those things.
I'd say it depends a little bit on the job ad. So if it is for a specific research project, then I think it doesn't, well, it still makes sense to highlight your expertise, but I think it's not really necessary to suggest a research project because it's already clear what you're going to work on. Sometimes there are job ads that say, oh, do you want to apply for a fellowship with me? And in this case, I think it can be important to highlight, oh yeah, I would like to do that. And I would like to work on this and this area. And ideally, this is then maybe an area where your potential supervisor has some experience in, but where you can bring maybe some additional method or some additional angle to it. And you can highlight that.
Great. Another question to Jiawen and Rainer, is which one is more important, scientific attitude or publications for getting postdoc position?
I don't know if I'm in a position to really answer that correctly, but I think it probably depends on the position as well. I think, like, you know, I can imagine for more senior postdoc positions, the publications are very important, but for ones where they're also open to people straight out of their PhD, maybe it's less important. I think it varies a lot per position. For me, I had preprints, but not published publications when I was applying and getting jobs.
Yeah, I think a publication is always good because it's something, you know, you can see and you can read, and that demonstrates you have already, you've been going through the process. I mean, if you don't have that, I think you can still make up for that by highlighting what type of skills you have and which projects you have worked. I think it's not an insurmountable disadvantage. You just work on your other strengths.
Great. Another question possibly is addressing to Rainer and Hector is there anything like keyword search while screening CV, or who is screening the CV and cover letters for postdoc or professor position? Is that typically HR personnel or specific roles in the institute or the company?
So I can only speak for my institution. So here usually the PI who advertises the position plus a number of committee members will read all of the applications. And I'm not aware of any automated keyword search or anything. Usually we would just virtually read all of the applications. That's why it is also, I think 2 pages, what Hector mentioned, it's probably a little bit on the short side, but I would definitely also say, don't list all of your publications. Maybe if you have like 2 or 3 publications that really demonstrate your strengths, maybe list those and write a sentence as to why you think they are important. But if this, I'd say maybe around 4 pages, the CV in length, but if it gets too long, then yeah.
And for me, in terms of who's screening, so we don't use keyword search. The only thing we use, for example, if I've got an undergraduate intern position for a placement year, we might check to see what graduation years people have. But a lot of the time, the keyword searches are so bad that you end up reading the CV anyway, to make sure you're keeping the right people in. But I think with the keyword search thing just is so still not good enough, and I think you miss out so much if you don't read a CV properly. So we tend to read it, and HR will read it initially, but we'll have very broad parameters in terms of type of experience and type of companies, and places that we're looking to hire for this role. And if we're unsure, we'd always pass it on to the manager. So you shouldn't get gatekeeped by someone who's not a scientist because they don't understand the CV.
Thank you for the answers. Another very interesting question is want to address to all speakers is LinkedIn or Twitter or other social media used for job hunting in either academia or industry like Illumina?
I will say all the postdoc positions I applied for, I saw on Twitter. So for me, it was very useful. Also, some of them were not advertised officially on the university's website. It was just ask me through personal communication. So it differs a lot for postdocs, I would say.
Yeah, we put all of our jobs on LinkedIn, so they're all there. It's useful, but all the jobs are also, it's useful because they're all in one place, and you can set up your parameters that you want to get alerts about and everything, rather than tracking 50 different websites that you want to work for.
Yeah, I use Twitter, LinkedIn, and then job application portals for advertising positions, so all of it. And I mean, I'd say if you are anyway on Twitter, for example, then that's a good kind of way to look for job ads. I mean, if this is not really your cup of tea, it can be a little bit draining to just log on to Twitter and go and look for job applications and build this network. Then maybe rather check LinkedIn or job portals.
Great. It looks like it's useful. Another question is for all speakers. For job applications for academia or industry, how would you explain circumstances related to health or disability, such as unusual timelines? Well, for example, longer PhD because of sick leave or a need for reasonable adjustments in the job.
So we have an accommodations process. So if you need extra accommodations, this is either for your interview or when you're here. We have a button that you can press, and then it goes through a whole process internally. But in terms of explaining anything like that, I mean, personally, I would be honest. I mean, especially if you're applying to a company that's working in human health, we like to think we understand those problems. I think I would be honest about that, but I don't know what the other side in academia says.
I mean, if your PhD took longer than usual, I think this is something that is probably picked up during the screening process. So people will kind of wonder about it, and then maybe it is just easier if you try to be honest about it. And of course, it's absolutely up to you how much detail you provide. But if you mention, yeah, the PhD took longer due to a period of sick leave, this is I think this, for me personally, it would be a sufficient explanation. But it can help maybe getting over the threshold that people wonder, yeah, why did this person took so long for their PhD?
Great, the explanation is good. Probably we're going to answer the last couple of questions. We're going to wrap up. So another question for all speakers, they're more into the publications and listed in the CV. Is it necessary to write your contributions for every publication in the CV, or just to list a few papers during your PhD or postdoc? So, and also what points should be kept in mind during the cover letter writing when we don't have publications?
So I would, yeah, the contribution of the publications, I don't know. I think this can make sense if you are maybe second or third author on the publication, but you think this is really a key publication for your CV, then you can write 1 or 2 sentences. I conducted this and this analysis, particularly if this analysis or this skill is really relevant for the job. I think that doesn't hurt. I wouldn't do that for like 20 publications. I would maybe highlight 2 or 3 and write 1 or 2 sentences what your contribution was. And I forgot the second part of the question. Oh, so the cover letter and the publications, I think.
When we don't have publications.
I don't think that this is necessarily a problem. I mean, you can state in the cover letter what your expertise is, what you think you bring to the table, but also stating why you are interested in that particular position. I've looked through some of my cover letters. I think I never actually mentioned publications there. I just wrote in general about myself and why I'm interested in that particular position.
So the last question is also addressing to all speakers. So are there ever instances, maybe more to Hector, in industry where applicants are overqualified? For example, having a PhD or transferring from a postdoc, and the company is looking for someone earlier in their career and who can be trained up in a specific way.
Yes, that happens quite frequently. And our solution to that, which isn't always possible, but we'd rather have the best person, and if they're overqualified, we'll try and increase the level of the role to match them, so that we can kind of compensate them fairly. So even if you didn't ask for it, we should make sure that people who've got that amount of experience get paid fairly and come in at the right level. That isn't always possible if there isn't budget for it, but that's the kind of guiding principles we use.
And also maybe addressing to Rainer, is there a overqualified situation for postdocs if they're applying for postdocs or PhDs wanting to get a new PhD? Is there such thing called overqualification?
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure. I think this applies to some postdoc positions. You can't be employed as a postdoc at every institution forever, basically. So after X number of years, you need HR or the regulations of the institution don't permit you to continue in that role. And particularly if the position is funded through a grant, then the salary is also not really flexible. You have a particular budget that you can offer, and you can't really go above that. And if you're overqualified, you're required to offer that person a higher salary that you don't really have the budget for. So then it can become really difficult, even though the PI may want this person. It can be difficult to hire them, but it really depends, I think, on the institution.
Cool. Thank you so much. So it's almost 1 o'clock and we need to wrap our seminar, our webinar, although we have so many questions we couldn't have a time to answer. And
can I say one small thing? So just one, because we have mentioned so often that so many, for every individual job application, there are so many CVs that come in. But what I would say, if your CV is well organized and if you match the skill set, then you have a really good chance to get invited to an interview. So it is really worth investing this time to improve your CV, I think.
Thank you so much for this very good suggestion for all our audience. So we hope that from this webinar, the insights from the speakers and tips we discussed can empower the audience to create a compelling power letter and CV. And a huge thank you to all the speakers for sharing their invaluable insights on this. And we appreciate your time and effort in making this webinar great success. And of course, a big thanks to all the audience for the active involvement. And I will turn the stage to Jason. And thank you so much, everyone.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us today's webinar. Special thank you to our speakers and moderator for all the insights and all the effort that you put into sharing your knowledge and thoughts about this topic. And so, as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is recorded, and we'll share the recording afterwards. And so be sure to keep an eye out for that, and then share this with your network. But other than that, I hope everyone have a great week, and hope we'll catch you at our next webinar. Have a good one, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.